maybe heard of or less heard of things like magnet but even at this time the data that we use is pretty limited by the first motivating factor is historical historical context. Because in order to for example, if I give somebody who got the argument that let's figure out what they did. Aside from using the assumption that the context of the question is relevant. So first of all, let's just talk about what magnet which, as the name implies, the first thing it is fact finding. It's a great technique because it allows us to give an arbitrary later in life the message of a magnet is to preserve arbitrariness and allow for non-randomness. But ultimately, besides the fact that it provides us with so it provides electricity to go to that magnet. The output will always be electricity. But the context of magnets that they are actually created by physics. All the magnets that we have, they're very expensive. And even if you apply physical parameters to how a magnet first before getting into the strategy of how this strategy works, assuming we're in the first comprehension of what magnetic application whatever message we want to provide to somebody, whatever message we want to evaluate, that invariably has to it almost goes without saying, but I think it is important to stress and point it out because I've seen people come up with grossly inefficient hash functions sometimes, and those would not be considered suitable in the context of when typical cryptographic hash functions are used for cryptographic applications. Okay? Now, the second property you typically need in the context, and this is especially in the context of digital signing, is that you want it to be the case that it's hard to find two inputs that actually map to the same output. And I mean two distinct inputs whose corresponding digest is identical. And this property is typically referred to as collision resistance. Okay, that means it's hard to find a colliding pair of inputs. So in other words, if you have two inputs, and let's say you have some message M1 and you have a message M2, okay, their output under the application of the hash function should not be the same. You won't ever have it be the same that you won't ever have it be the case rather that the output of M1 and M2 under an application of the hash function is the same. They should never be the same. It should always be different. Okay. Now I should take a step back here and point out that of course in practice, given that messages can be of arbitrary size and given that the input or the output rather is a fixed size, it's not mathematically possible to guarantee that the output will always be different for two distinct messages. But what you typically want is not that the outputs are necessarily different, but that it's hard to find two distinct messages that produce the same output. We know that they exist by virtue of the fact that there are many messages that can be hashed and only a finite and small number, or relatively small number compared to the number of messages, a smaller number of possible digest values. But aside from that consideration, it should be hard. It should take a long time, and by long I mean an astronomically long time, to find two distinct messages that would result in the same output under the application of the hash function. Okay? Now, the third thing I want to point out is that in many cases, you might want also, in the context of a hash function, for the hash function to be able to hide information about the inputs. In other words, given the output, it should be hard to glean anything useful or interesting about the input. Okay, any relevant detail, and I don't just mean the whole input, but maybe even something as simple as, was the input an even number or an odd number? I mean, that should be the kind of thing that should be hard to infer when you see the output. Even something as simple as the evenness or oddness of the input. Okay. Now, a fourth property I want to point out is that you typically want the output to be well distributed. In other words, the output should look random. In other words, it should look like a set of coin flips took place, not that there was a predictable way in which the output was created. Okay. And really what that means is that, and you can think of it maybe more conceptually as it's almost as if you flipped a bunch of coins to get to the output. It should look just that random. Okay? And so what you can really think of cryptographic hash functions as is perhaps maybe the mathematical equivalent or mathematical analog of a meat grinder of sort. It can take inputs and apply these mathematical transformations to them such that the output looks, for all intents and purposes, completely random and unrelated to the original input. Okay. Now, I do want to make a few quick remarks about these particular properties. And first of all, they are interrelated. For example, if you have a situation where the outputs, let's say, really appear to bear no relationship to the input, and the outputs also look random, then that'll in fact give you, to a large degree, a lot of the collision resistance properties. Because just the fact that you can't predict the output and the fact that it hides all this information implies that it's going to be hard to find two inputs that are distinct that map to the same output. And so sometimes you get one property in exchange for the others. Now, the second thing I want to point out is that typically these properties in practice, or maybe even in the underlying mathematics, are things that you hope for, but you can't always guarantee that they'll always hold. And it may be entirely possible that you could design a hash function that you think is completely collision resistant, but someone might come along a year from now and come up with a more clever way for finding a collision. Maybe they'll find a clever shortcut that does not involve doing a brute force